everybody. Welcome to Table Talk, a place for honest conversations and getting to meet friends. I'm Betsy Thompson. So excited to be here with Mike Schumacher once again. So thankful.
You invited me back.
So. And listen, we're going to kind of make it a regular thing because there's so many things we could talk about, and it's hard to squish them all into one. So I was like, Mike, just start coming back and let's just talk about things. And so I'm so thankful you're willing to do this. Y'all, yesterday was Valentine's Day. When you're watching this, listening to it, whenever it releases. Yesterday was Valentine's Day. Super fun day. It's all over. It's in all the stores. It's at the drive-thrus, out in the parking lots where you don't actually have to go in the store, to do all the things. We see it everywhere. And there is this very worldly view of Valentine's Day should be this thing. And at the same time, whether you're in a relationship, not in a relationship, with your kids, with a spouse, with a boyfriend, whatever, there is also this other super weighty thing that I think Valentine's Day brings, and that's loneliness.
Yeah.
And so I asked Mike, I said, hey, let's just talk about loneliness.
Yeah.
Because we know people feel it all the time.
Yeah.
It's a real deal. You had some statistics of just so many people if you asked them, they would say, yeah, I'm lonely.
Absolutely, Betsy. What I do most every day is meet with people, mostly Christians, and oftentimes individuals, but a lot of couples even. Mm-hmm. And you can be very lonely even in the midst of relationship.
Absolutely.
Even within the midst of a marriage. Mm-hmm. You can sit in a big group, in a meeting, or actually in a church.
That's right.
Of 1,000 people.
Walk in every Sunday morning and feel completely
even though
alone.
you're around people, it's kind of what's called a crowded loneliness. Mm-hmm. So loneliness, when you asked me to think about and talk about loneliness, I thought, well, that's pretty simple. Everybody can relate to that, but it's actually really complicated. There are lots of factors.
There's so much.
It's kind of really cool to kind of talk about it.
I'm excited that we're going to get to kind of dive into it because I think, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but there is especially a stigma, I think, for Christians that we shouldn't be lonely.
Yeah.
But then we've talked about that before. There's lots of stigmas for mental health and emotional issues for Christians that we're not supposed to have any of those. And that's one of the reasons Mike's coming on, because we're going to break those and really say, y'all, even as a believer, you don't need to feel guilty that you struggle.
Absolutely. But I'm glad you said that and even introduced this whole topic that way. Betsy, that's really the nature of what I do here at Sagemont as the director of the counseling center and a counselor myself who's dealing with hurting people, struggling people, almost all of whom are Christians.
Yeah.
And trying to communicate to our church and to the church at large that if you're a regular person and you're hurting, you're struggling, you're wounded, you're dealing with stuff in our lives, you're not the weird one. You're actually really fairly normal. 100%. And trying to communicate to people that it's okay to be honest about that and to even seek help when you need it.
Yes.
That's what the counseling ministry is all about. It's really what drives what God, I think, wants me to do. Mm-hmm. And so this is part of it, just to be able to talk about this kind of, and make it okay.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So, just basic definition of loneliness you kind of gave us is just a state of distress or discomfort that results when one person perceives a gap between one's desires of social connection and actual experience.
Yeah, I think the way God has wired us, the way He's designed us as humans, He's built us for connection, for relationship. And a lot of us are in a certain amount of distress because there's a breakdown. There's a lack of connection. There's a lack of relationship. There's a lack of emotional intimacy. And so we see this all around us. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think probably even just in our culture right now, tons of people live alone.
Yeah.
Tons of people live completely, by themselves.
I read that 30% more people live alone than used to be a few years ago. A lot more people will live alone.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I know I had my second daughter went off after she graduated and was working and lived alone for about 6 months. And she was like, I have to have a roommate.
Yeah.
I need, she said, I see people all the time, but it's different. Just that I think there's a huge part. So we have a ton of people that live alone.
Yeah.
We are still, interesting, 4 years later, coming off of COVID.
Yes, that's a factor.
And the isolation that we were told to do, and then coming back from that.
Yeah.
And And then, of course, social media and just the internet and the World Wide Web and all the things.
That's fascinating to kind of explore as part of the cultural changes that I think, in some ways, it's complicated, have even facilitated, even made more prominent. Loneliness. It's interesting, as I was looking at some of the stats, just thinking through this, is that young people are the loneliest people that are reporting a sense of loneliness, and it peaks at 19. These are the people who are growing up in this media-saturated, social media-saturated culture, and yet they say they're the most lonely. I was talking to Jason, and he was saying a stat I didn't read, but it's so relevant, that 65% of men say that they struggle with loneliness.
Sure.
So it's a big issue, even within the church.
Absolutely.
That's the key. That even Christian people who attend church report the same degree of loneliness. There's something fascinating about that, disturbing about that.
Sure.
But it's good that we can, again, kind of talk about that.
And I think probably, I know one reason when I find myself starting to feel lonely, I can stop and look and go, okay, what am I doing? And a huge part of it you talk about up here is isolating. Yeah. Physically getting alone. But then also it's even like if I'm here at church every Sunday, I can still isolate in a giant room.
That's so true. I think that happens, particularly, there's even some vulnerabilities of it. The bigger the room, the more people. Yep. It's a wonderful thing. We want to grow our church, certainly, and we want to see those big numbers, and it's awesome that we're experiencing that kind of growth. Wonderful thing. One of the vulnerabilities of that is if you're an individual in that big group, if you're not in a more intimate kind of a setting within the big group, you can get lost. Absolutely. You can be totally alone. Yeah. In that big group. I have experienced that. I think probably all have, whether it's church or some other kind of a group where you're around all kinds of people in the room, and yet you're feeling very much all alone. Yeah. That's a very common phenomenon.
Yeah. Do you think there's something to do with that, where it is us putting up walls because we've been hurt, or we're just not sure if we trust the person I'm talking to, or the place, whatever it may be? I've built these walls that are isolating me, but I'm the one that's built them?
I think that's a part of it, Betsy. I think that's very insightful. I think part of the nature of being humans and going through life is that we all tend to put up certain kinds of walls to protect ourselves. And
some healthy boundaries, right? Some boundaries are very healthy.
Absolutely. It's very appropriate. Maybe someday we'll talk about just the appropriateness of boundaries when you're around people who might hurt you.
Right.
That's a very appropriate thing to do. So yes, some of that is, I think, self-directed in that we tend to protect and isolate. I think we're doing more of that than ever.
Me too.
I think we're having a harder time as a culture, young people, but as a culture, experiencing emotional intimacy. I think it's hard. It's hard in a marriage for a lot of us.
Sure.
To deal with letting down walls, barriers, engaging with people on a deeper level, a more honest, a more sincere. A lot of that's shame. Yeah. A lot of that's fear.
Yes.
And so a lot of, I kind of specialize in marriage counseling, and so I'm dealing with couples all the time who come in to see me, and at the core of the issues often are a breakdown of relationship, of connection.
Right.
And so it's so important.
Yeah. And I think if you're struggling with that, it's not easy to actually address it and deal with it and move past it. Yeah. And so then that in turn probably just perpetuates your loneliness, because you're like, that's going to be really hard. So I'm just going to hang out over here a little bit longer and not actually want to deal with the issues.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you add to that what you alluded to a few minutes ago, is that even within a Christian culture, we sometimes as Christians, we have a hard time admitting our struggles, our loneliness, our breakdowns, because I think there's this implied message that if you're a Christian, you got it all together.
Right.
And so I think you sit in a room on a Sunday morning of, however many hundreds and hundreds of people, and there are lots of hurting people, but you got to put on that mask. You got to act like you've got it all together.
Right.
And frankly, probably very few of us have it close to all together.
Absolutely.
so we tend to do some of our own hiding,
yes.
so to speak.
Yeah.
I
think about,
those reasons.
growing up, what did you wear to church? You wore your Sunday best.
Yeah.
That's what you had to, you put on your Sunday best. And I think so often now it might not be the clothes we wear, necessarily, but it sure is the facade we put on of, okay, I can't let people know what I'm struggling with. I can't. And does that transfer over to what we think about Jesus? That I have to do that with him? Like, where we take human characteristics and put those on the Lord?
That's a good question. Maybe that does happen sometimes. Even our sense of shame or embarrassment or a sense of failure. Obviously, the Lord is a God of grace and receives us, loves us despite our struggles and walks with us through those struggles.
Absolutely.
And I really admire people who, whether they come to counseling or they just in other forums, can just be honest about, we all have stuff, we all have... None of us have arrived. None of us are sanctified.
Right.
We all have a certain amount of baggage that God's working on.
Yep.
And I really appreciate people who go to support groups or go to various ministries or come to counseling who can say, by virtue of being here, I'm acknowledging I'm a normal person who has struggles. We want to breed that culture. With Pastor Levi does an awesome job of that, and our culture of Sagemont is really designed by things like this, where we take seriously giving permission to people. You don't have it all together, and you don't have to have it all together.
Right.
And so, that's why this topic is important. Yeah.
And would you say that there are very varying levels of loneliness?
Yeah.
Where there is I feel lonely today.
Yes.
Versus, I feel so lonely, I don't even know that I want to speak to anybody or leave the house, or there's varying levels of how serious it is.
I think that's another really good point. Loneliness is not one thing. There are different levels. Some loneliness, I think by virtue of being human, we all experience some loneliness.
Yes.
I just think that's true.
Absolutely.
For most of us, unless we're just oblivious.
Right. And I think because we are living in a fallen world where we are created for heaven, where we will not feel lonely anymore. And again, I wrote it down. John 16:33 says, you will have trouble. Jesus told us you will have trouble. And so living here, we are fooling ourselves if we think, if I come to know Jesus, I'm done. Everything's awesome. Rainbows and flowers forever. Like, that's not truth.
Yeah.
But some people push it as truth.
Yeah, I mentioned to you a very important thing I learned and read about that I would love for people to know about if you are concerned about this at all, is a guy named J.I. Packer, who wrote a book, Knowing God. It's been around for a long time, was very influential in my spiritual growth. There's a chapter in that book called These Inward Trials, and Packer makes this, I think, profound statement that applies to what you're saying. He says, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, he says, even if you mean well, or we mean well, our preachers mean well, our teachers mean well by over-promising the benefits of coming to Christ, even because we want to evangelize people and we want to kind of share the gospel, we want to sell the gospel. If you overemphasize and overpromise, he says, he uses the word, and it has always resonated with me. He says that's cruel, actually.
I would agree.
Because it's overpromising. And so normal people, they come to Christ sometimes, and they make the assumption that because now I'm a believer, life will go well, family will go well, bad things won't happen.
Right.
That is kind of an over-promising. And I see so many people who are in the faith, who are sincere believers, who are in struggle. Families are struggling. There are all kinds of issues. And now they have to deal with the shame. Because
Absolutely.
I was told that everything would go well if I'm a believer. Everything would be, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's the subtle message.
Yeah.
I would say, in a way, it's a form of the prosperity gospel, frankly. It's a kind of an emotional prosperity gospel. We have to be careful about that. When we share the faith, with people that it's not a promise that everything will go swimmingly forever.
Right.
It's not. And
It's a promise of salvation with him.
Yeah.
And that he's with us
then-
through the hard stuff. He's with us.
Absolutely. He will walk with us.
Yeah.
He's sovereign over the hard stuff.
That's right. He knows it. He's got a plan. We have those promises, but not the promise of it's going to be easy.
But sometimes I need to talk to a pastor or a friend or a counselor or a mentor and be honest about the struggles that I'm having.
Yeah.
But if we've been led to believe and we have to portray that everything's together, it's hard to do that. It's
Absolutely.
hard to be honest. So yes, I think there are varying degrees of loneliness.
Yeah.
Some loneliness is transitory, comes and goes.
Right.
It's situational.
Situational.
Yeah,
Yes.
and we all deal with that.
Yes.
There's a kind of loneliness. Some loneliness is more chronic, though. And I think that can lend itself towards the very real thing that we call depression, anxiety. As Christians, I really believe this, and I see it every day. I see it in my own life. I see it with the people I work with. Sometimes we struggle with things like depression
Sure.
and loneliness. So it's very real. And if you live in loneliness for a long time, sometimes there's a chicken and the egg thing. If you live in loneliness for a long time, it's very likely that you'll experience a kind of depression and anxiety. So I think it is variable. It's complex. There are lots of factors involved.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What are some things that if someone's saying, okay, I'm lonely, they're listening to this and they're saying, I'm lonely. Am I lonely where I need to seek help? Am I lonely where I'm at a point where I need someone else to speak into this?
Yeah.
What are some of those things that somebody could say, okay, let me look at my life right now, different factors that they might see?
Yeah. As I said, I think everybody experiences loneliness to some degree. When loneliness is disruptive to our lives, when we're experiencing things like discouragement, sadness, that could even lead to kind of despair, and we're living in that for a while, and we're not popping out of that.
Yeah.
When we're struggling, I think that's the time to go to a good friend. Doesn't always have to be a professional counselor, or to even go to a doctor. You know, one of the things I read about and looked at in terms of loneliness is it has all kinds of effects on us, physiological effects on us. People who are lonely report much higher degrees of high blood pressure, all kinds of things, heart disease.
Yeah.
I read one study that said chronic loneliness is like, it's the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's the kind of destruction it can do in our lives.
Just to your body.
Just to our bodies. And then you add to that the kind of relationship loneliness, breakdown in a marriage.
Yeah.
You know, where you know, there's something called the delay effect in marriage. Some of the researchers have shown that most marriages that ultimately come to counseling have waited about 6 years too long.
Probably.
You know, because we deny, we minimize. And so when those
and you have good days every once in a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you go, well, look, we're okay.
Yeah, so when those breakdowns continue to happen, it's not just transitory where we all experience a kind of sadness. Maybe there's grief in our life that's very legitimate, very real. When they start to get debilitating, when they start to affect our lives, and we're not bouncing back, I think that's the time to go to a friend or a pastor, or actually call a counselor and say, hey, I need to visit. I need to figure some stuff out.
Yeah, I think that's really good. One of the statistics I thought was super interesting that you shared was you said it earlier that around 19 is kind of that peak age. But one of the things you said, older adults 65 plus reported feeling the least lonely.
Isn't that interesting?
I thought that was so
I wonder
very
why that
interesting.
is. That's what the research shows, that people who are older, 65 plus, they report the least amount of loneliness. I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Maybe at that point they're like, I'm sharing my stuff, like my walls are down. There's not the inhibition to be honest with each other. They've done enough life, maybe. I don't know.
It could be. Here's a theory, hypothesis. I don't know whether that relates to our culture that's saturated with the internet and social media, where older folks are, they know how to do relationships better than our young people.
That's very true.
You know, I wonder if that's part of it. I do think with our younger folks, and look, I think the internet and social media can be a good thing.
Sure.
I mean, in a way, it's like a gun. a gun is a really wonderful instrument tool, but it really has to be managed.
That's right.
It's dangerous left unmanaged.
Absolutely.
And I think in some ways that's kind of like social media and the internet. I find so many young people don't know how to do relationships. They don't understand, or they are fearful of emotional intimacy. I kind of liken it to, I think it's a little funny, but as I understand it, a lot of young people these days, they don't even know how to write or read cursive.
Yeah.
It's like they've lost that skill. They don't, and I wonder if in some ways we all have to some degree, but they particularly have lost the skill of emotional intimacy. They don't understand it.
Right.
You know what's also sad is that maybe they're in families where that's not modeled.
Sure.
You know, and so it's not all their fault, maybe.
No, everybody's sitting in their own room.
Yeah.
In their own, in their homes, but all in their own rooms, not building just that the family unit, natural relationships that should be helping to show them how to do it outside of just the family.
Could be.
And everybody's
part of it.
just in their rooms.
Yeah.
Well, I know, I was joking with my girls the other day. I was like, y'all, when I was in high school and junior high and growing up, if somebody wanted to call me, they had to call the phone in the house, and they didn't know who was going to answer.
That's exactly right.
You did. I mean, it could have been your mom, your dad, your older brother, your baby brother, kids don't have to do that now. And even that little bit that you think, well, that's a silly thing. No, but now if you look at him and go, hey, why don't you call him? I'm just going to text him.
That's a kind of relationship breakdown.
Yes.
I was talking to a young person the other day too who was saying, I don't like to talk on the phone.
Yes.
They don't even like to talk on a cell phone.
No.
You know, everything's gotta be
listen, if you can text me, don't call me.
That's
right.
right.
I mean, 100%.
And so, again, that may sound like not such a big deal, but I wonder if that's part of what we're seeing here, part of the breakdown, part of the implication where we've lost the ability to connect with people in better ways.
Yeah.
And so
it's going to be interesting to see the 19-year-olds now when they're 60.
Yeah.
Because maybe the older folks, it's because they had to do relationships face to face, sitting on the front porch, walking over to their friend's house. That's what they did, and so they're just still really good at it.
And so, we have joked often, probably all of us have, about going to dinner with your spouse or your kids and sitting in that restaurant and watching the couple at the table next to you who aren't even talking to each other. They're on their screens. Both of them.
Yep.
And that might be in a living room. But it may be in a restaurant.
Absolutely.
You go on a date night with your spouse and you spend your time looking at the phones. There's something that affects, I think, us as humans, as people who are designed for relationships, that's breaking down. You know, sometimes when I'm working with couples, just trying to get them to find time in their lives to develop some rituals, to actually have a forum to talk.
Right.
We're too busy. Or we've got all kinds of electronics and screens going on and good things, again, but there's a breakdown in actual relationships.
Well, and there's a safety net to me texting you what I'm thinking versus me saying it to your face.
Yeah.
There's a safety net there. And I think we get very used to, this is the safe way for me to communicate to you.
Yeah.
Instead of the vulnerability it takes to actually talk to somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I see in all of us to some degree, but young people particularly who are very much tied to social media these days, is what I've called Facebook depression. If all you see, if your reality of the world around you largely is generated by your impressions, your interactions on something like Facebook or other kinds of social media, it's not real.
That's right.
And so most of it is based around comparison, which just generates a sense of I'm not good enough.
Absolutely.
There's a breakdown of, again, this ability to connect with real people in real time about real things in a deeper, more meaningful way. Everything stays very superficial.
Yeah.
And it's false to a large degree anyway. We only show
Sure.
our best on Facebook.
Yep.
You know, it's not real life.
Right.
And yet if you're a person who is very much tied to social media and that's your view of reality, it can be very distorting.
Absolutely.
Which again generates this sense of loneliness. There's something wrong with me. I'm
Right.
not like other people, but it's not true.
And that was that is one of the biggest reasons that I said I want to do this and have it come out the day after Valentine's Day, because there are people that on Valentine's Day, loneliest day, fall into depression because they're looking at social media and going, look at all these other people that have X, Y, and Z, and I don't. Even if they have a person, instead of going, I'm going to love on this person, well, they go, well, we didn't do this and this and this.
Yeah.
Or we can't do it this way. And so that's a huge reason I was like, let's have this conversation right after a super difficult day.
Yeah.
Even for people that are in relationships.
Yeah.
It still can end up being a very lonely time.
Absolutely. I think this is perfect timing for this. You know, within the church, we rightly emphasize marriage, and there's not typically as much divorce going on, which is a wonderful thing. I spend my life trying to keep couples together and thriving, but you can stay married for lots of years and yet be very distant.
Absolutely.
Very separated. And so that's what we're trying, and lonely because of that.
Yeah.
So trying to encourage people and teach people how to develop that kind of emotional intimacy, which is kind of the antidote to this thing we're calling loneliness.
Right. So I think hopefully you've heard us say, everyone deals with loneliness. It is okay to feel lonely. You need to recognize it, right? Our feelings are good because they help us gauge where we're at, but they shouldn't be the thing driving us.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be the steer of where we're going, but we need to see them. So now I want us to go, okay, people that are watching or listening and going, I'm lonely, or my child, I can tell they're lonely, or my friend tells me they're lonely all the time. What are tools? What are things we can do to help someone out of that, help ourselves out of that, or at least start even a baby step?
Yeah, really good question. And one of the things that I just jotted down here are just some ideas about antidotes to loneliness. So let's talk about that a little bit. There's different kinds of loneliness, obviously. There's a kind of spiritual loneliness. So let me just start there, with the idea of, and this sounds trivial and cliche-ish, but there's real profound truth to it. So many of us, when I'm lonely, when I'm struggling, I find myself distancing from God. And so I'm hurting, I'm upset, I'm frustrated, I'm discouraged. And so that again sounds cliche-ish, but it's so true.
It's true.
To draw near to the Lord during those darker, discouraging seasons of life. That has to be said. I think that has to be emphasized. One of the things I find great comfort in as I've looked through different, even Psalms, for instance, and looking at the various psalm writers who are honest about their loneliness.
Yes.
You know, there's a bunch of psalms that talk about that. So drawing near to God, speaking out to God, praying to God, calling upon God is a good place to start, obviously. And
I love that.
That sounds cliche-ish again, but it's profound.
It's truth.
It's truth. Absolutely. To be honest with God, to ask for Him to minister to us in ways that nobody else can.
And here's the awesome thing is He can handle it.
Absolutely.
Right? He can handle us coming to Him and going, I'm super lonely and I don't know what I'm supposed to do.
Absolutely.
He wants us to.
Yeah. One of the things that we've talked about is, and again, I'm wary of this because, again, I don't want to make this sound simplistic, but one of the reasons that we encourage people to go to church even is to, even though you can be in that big room and feel all alone, it is a good way to not only connect and worship God in a very meaningful way, but it's a way to be around in a healthy way. Community. God has made us for community. It is part of the Christian life. It's part of our emotional well-being. So putting us in an environment where we're worshiping, we're singing. A lot of people who do get lonely are the people who, and chronically lonely, they'll disappear from church.
Yeah.
Maybe for all kinds of reasons, maybe it's hard to be honest and open about that, and so there's shame, and so I just disappear. On the contrary, I would say fight that. Get actually more connected to God in all those kinds of ways. So come, worship, those kinds of things are so crucial. We've talked about this, Betsy, and you've been a big part of this over the years. Getting involved in a smaller kind of a forum in the midst of the big place, of the big church. We talk about much of your ministry has been about getting people connected where you can explore and experience on a more intimate level relationships. So a small group, a connect group, a support group, a Bible study. Here's another thing. What happens, I notice, and myself and other people, when we're lonely, when we're depressed, when we're discouraged, we go passive. And so the challenge to all of us is to fight through that, to be honest about it. I don't want to minimize or deny it, but to actually fight against the tendency, the inertia to go passive and actually try to get more engaged. Try to initiate relationships. That's right. When we're hurting, frustrated, discouraged, again, we go passive and we wait for other people to initiate, and we can do that. So getting involved in those kinds of ways. Practicing hospitality. That's I guess maybe even a gift, I think, that isn't as emphasized as much as it used to be anymore. People used to invite relationships and connection and people over, and there's more, go to lunch, and get involved. I don't know if we do that quite as much as we used to do.
Again, I think it's gone from the front porch to the backyard and the garage door closed, and, we have that part of it. And I think there is a huge part is think about somebody else. Take your thoughts off of you and think about somebody else. Make cookies for somebody else. Make a card for somebody else. Take somebody else dinner. I mean, just those little things is going to start that process, I think.
I think you're right. There's a balance. We can emphasize and our own normalizing our struggle and our hurt and our loneliness, and there's a place for that, to be honest about that. But you're right. We can be consumed by that and get obsessed by that. And so the challenge I think God has for us is to focus on other people some too. It breaks us out of that self kind of obsessing focus on our own pain. And so if we can do that, that's very helpful. Have a friend. Pursue friendships. When we're lonely, sometimes we disband, we isolate. And so encourage people to get involved and talk to somebody. Find a friend, find a coach, talk to a minister, call the counseling center and say, I need to talk to a counselor. I want to make some changes. It's very good to do.
When you walk into a connect group or a Bible study or a support group, first of all, we get just even the walking in is a deal, and we get that. But like you said, push through that, sign up, walk in, show up, and then when you get there, tell somebody, hey, I need you to text me or call me the day before this and say, hey, are you coming? I want to see you there. And then you say, and you give, and I'll do the same for you. You start building that accountability. Yes. Is that vulnerable to say to somebody? Absolutely. Do you have to know them for 2 years before you can say that to them? No. That's part of being willing to try to build those relationships. And I think so often we walk into the room and think I'm the only one that needs that. But everybody else in the room is like, if you walk up and say, hey, I don't know about you, but it's a deal that I'm here. And so can we hold each other accountable to showing up? Most people are going to be like, thank you. I prayed that somebody would reach out to me. And so we think it's only us and nobody else feels that way.
I'm the only one here who's insecure or who's lonely.
Doesn't have any friends. You assume everybody else knows everybody else and they're doing the thing, that's a form of isolation when we start telling ourselves those lies and they keep us in this lonely state.
Yes, absolutely. And the fact of the matter is most of the people in that room are probably having similar struggles. Absolutely. And it's the beauty of social media and texting. I don't want to be a Luddite who basically says, oh, that's bad. It's not.
No.
Those are good tools. Those are good avenues to connect with people and take initiative and break out of that passivity. So those are cool things.
And I think for y'all to realize, I know in this weird way, in the position I'm in, people look at me and go, one, she's got it all together. No, I don't. Two, she's got all these friends. I'm like, no, I don't.
Yeah.
And it's like, I want to say that to break down those walls of, I talk to people and say hello and how are you, and they have a name tag on, cool, you know, all that kind of stuff. But listen, I'm not the girl that has 50,000 people calling to check on me all the time.
Yeah.
I have to be purposeful to have relationships, vulnerable, real relationships with people. And I think you would probably say the same thing.
Absolutely.
I think staff in general, we are not these people that are like, just because I know somebody on a Sunday morning to say hello to them doesn't mean that I have these deep relationships with all these people. We have to be purposeful, as it doesn't just happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I so appreciate you even saying that, because people I think would look at Betsy.
Yes.
You do this, you do all kinds of things, and
I fight it so hard.
But to be able to say,
fight it because
I'm
it's not
just
real.
like everybody else.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you saying that.
Absolutely, because, and I think we always say, oh, women really struggle with this. Men struggle with it too. I think men can hide behind it a little bit more, but. And also, you said, I think I've heard this a ton. Women have a lot more words that we use during the day than men do, which again, I think is the breakdown sometimes in a marriage when you get home and the man's like, I did my words.
That's right.
I'm done.
Yeah.
So how are you having conversations with your spouse? And so again, figure that out, talk about that, have those conversations. But there is this thing about everybody's walking around and they all have best friends and I'm the only one that doesn't.
Yeah.
It's such a lie.
It's not true.
It's such a lie.
Yeah, so those are some things to deal with, this kind of brand of spiritual loneliness that are, I hope, very helpful. Within a relationship, that's really key, is to acknowledge, evaluate what's the level within even a marriage or a friendship, the level of emotional intimacy.
Yeah.
Where are we in that?
Yep.
Some of us are better at that than others.
Yeah.
And so, I encourage couples to, like you said, literally talk more.
Yes.
That it's in some ways a lost art. And you mentioned the statistics about which I think are so interesting. Stereotypically, it's true. Obviously, that it's not always true.
Right.
But most men don't typically talk as much as their wives. Sometimes just flip flop. But to actually encourage people to engage in more conversation, but at a deeper level. There are levels of conversation. We can within a relationship, you can talk at a very superficial level.
Yep.
That kind of cliche church level where it's just very, very top drawer, top level kinds of things. Within emotional intimacy, it's much better to talk at a deeper level. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are your dreams? That's hard for a lot of couples.
Yeah.
It's hard for a lot of married couples to even do good eye contact. It's kind of a lost art.
Yes.
So there's this disconnect with a lot of people. Yeah. I encourage couples that I work with every day to carve out time together as much as they can, develop rituals. One of the rituals I think is really kind of a cool thing to build the sense of emotional intimacy is actually a non-sexual kind of touching that some of us do better than others.
Right. You're supposed to hug every day.
Within a marriage, obviously, but one of the I'm not good at this. I don't want to. This isn't necessarily the best thing I do. But one of the things that my wife and I have tried to do with our adult kids when they come over, we've made it a ritual. It was a little awkward at first because I'm this kind of affection is not normal for me in my background. But we've practiced hugging our adult kids when they come over.
Yeah.
Now, it seems like such a simple thing, but it's been something good for me. It builds a kind of connection on a deeper level. Actually, it's fascinating to me. There's actually even a neurological, biological phenomenon that happens when we touch people in a healthy way. Hug, touch, non-sexual touch, all those kinds of things. There's a release of a chemical in the brain called oxytocin.
Yeah.
It is the bonding neurochemical. And so when we do that, and again, in a very appropriate way, something even neurologically is happening. Yeah. There's a deeper level of connection. So in some distressed relationships, friendships, marriages, there is this breakdown or isolation even within touching and
Absolutely.
in this healthy kind of way.
Yep.
So
yeah, and having those conversations, because I know in my house, my girls, I have a few that they will lay their head on my shoulder. They want to hug, even though they're older. Like, they love to hug. And then I have a couple that are like, we're going to pray together. Here's my finger. You can hold my finger while we pray. Not cool. And you just have to kind of learn, okay, where's everybody's balances? And then at the same time, one of my sweeties, it's like, hold my finger. I'm like, but I am going to hug you.
Yeah.
Because it's important for you. It's a deal. And so, but again, it's having those conversations. Yeah. It's explaining as they get older, this is why we need to do this. I want you to be able to have a good, healthy relationship with your people. Let's have those conversations.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. One of the things I try to teach with couples, again, is some just practical ideas about developing emotional intimacy within a relationship, particularly a marriage, is to do what one writer talks about, bids for connection. Those don't have to be complicated. Mm-hmm. People who study marriages and marriages that do really well, the masters of marriage, actually, they have all the kinds of distresses and arguments and conflicts as anybody else. But one thing they do well, they have a sense of fondness and admiration for each other that's expressed through these what are called bids for connection. Bids for connection, which means taking initiative, making a comment, making a smile, making an eye exchange that's a bid for a connection. And when those bids are made, couples that are doing well, that have a level of emotional intimacy, there are lots of these bids going on, hundreds of them, very subtle ways. They don't have to be big things, little things, but the couples who are the masters of this kind of a thing, they do lots of bidding, and when bids are made to a connection, join with me, talk with me, relate to me, look at me. People who do well in those, they receive those, they respond well to those. And you can receive a bid, you can reject a bid. And so things like this are ways to develop a sense of emotional connection within a relationship, particularly a marriage. Yeah.
I think that's so important. I think sometimes probably those bids, sometimes if they're coming often, we take them for granted. Yeah. And then when they're not there, you're like, wait a second, what happened to the thing? And they're like, well, you never acknowledged it. I'm like, oh, I will start acknowledging that. Please, even this morning, honest, I was walking out and Donald goes, you look really pretty today.
That's a bid. Yeah.
And I went, okay. And literally driving in here, I was like, I need to go back and tell him that means a ton to me and that is kind to me. And I appreciate that. But you do kind of get in the habit of, okay,
that's perfect. And so in some distressed marriages, in distressed marriages, there is one or both parties who've quit making bids. Right. They're not making them anymore.
Not doing it.
Or if one is, and the other party consistently is rejecting the bid or not responding to the bid or kind of ignoring the bid, you know what always will happen? The party who's been making the bids, they'll quit.
Eventually they stop.
And then when both quit, marriages that may stay together, may stay away from a divorce court, may look good on a Sunday, but they're not close because nobody's making any bids anymore. Yeah. And so there's this isolation, this distance, there's a breakdown of connection, certainly a breakdown of emotional intimacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, I could talk about this forever because I still have like 10 other things. I'm like, we can talk about this and we can talk about this. But I don't want us to go on forever. But I will say, y'all, this is such an important thing. Obviously, just the fact that we talked for this long about it, and there's still a ton more we could talk about. Take time to really look at your relationships and why you feel lonely. Or is your spouse feeling lonely and you're ignoring it or kind of going, you're not lonely, you're right here with me. Like, have those conversations, be open to that, be aware of it around you, and then do something about it. We might all feel lonely, but we don't have to be lonely. Yeah. We might feel that way, but God didn't design us to be lonely. Yeah. And so do something about it. Call the counseling center. Call me. Call the church. Find a friend that you haven't reached out to in a long time and go, hey, we haven't hung out in a while. Can we just spend time together? Open up the scripture. Psalms, great place to go and find people that were crying out to the Lord going, where are you? What's happening? I feel lonely, and he hears them. So do those kinds of things. And then if you still feel stuck, please reach out to us.
Absolutely.
Like, please reach out to us. We don't want you, especially here at Sagemont. We love everybody, but man, I don't want our people walking in and out of Sagemont feeling alone.
And we are so fortunate that this church over many years now has committed to providing the kinds of resources through a counseling center. Again,
Yes.
just a commercial for that.
Absolutely.
But it's a resource most churches don't have.
Yep.
Our church cares about our people and is honest about the fact that we want people to be open when they struggle. We've got some resources for that.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
take advantage of that.
Take advantage of those. Mike, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Betsy.
We will do this again. If you have a topic that you are like, I would love to hear Mike's view on this, please send those to me. I'm planning on having Mike back because these are so good for us to talk about. So I appreciate you sharing your wisdom
Thanks
and
for
being
having
willing
me.
to do it. Y'all, have a good weekend. Come to church on Sunday, and we will see you next time on Table Talk.